I want to talk to you about Article 5 of the Constitution.
Hello, my name is Jeff. I wanted to reach out to you, and out of the gate, I think it's very cool that you're learning about Article 5 and talking about it because it's a powerful part of our Constitution and deserves a lot more attention than it normally gets.
Article 5 is how we amend the Constitution. There are two ways. The first one is the way that we have always done it, and it requires 2/3 vote of both of houses of Congress. So that means 2/3 of the House of Representatives and 2/3 of the Senate. I want to talk to you about the other way. The other way has been used once. That was in Philadelphia in 1787. And that is a constitutional convention.
The Constitution is purposefully terse. They didn't want to have to spell out all of the minutiae, and they actually believed that we had the capacity to figure it out, and that if we couldn't learn from their example, that we could set a better one. In Article 2, they don't talk about how large the courtroom is supposed to be or the standards evidence. They didn't want the founding document to be clogged up with all of that stuff. That was really just something for us to figure out. They knew that we would understand our needs better than they did. One of their main goals was to protect we the people from an overreaching tyrannical federal government. They had just tossed off that yoke. So about Article 5, they expected us to know what a convention is, and we do. And subject matter experts know the finer details about how they should be conducted. Again, the framers of the Constitution knew that we could figure out the parts that weren't spelled out.
There is an organization that is called the Convention of States.
You forgot a whole bunch of folks, including ALEC, the Assembly of States, and the group that I volunteer for, Wolfpack. And the fact that these groups are all using the same method for different agendas is because, one, conventions are like voting. It's available for everyone. And two, the agenda for the convention is one way to constrain the delegates. As an example, ALEC wants to have a balanced budget amendment proposed. The Convention of States group that you talked about wants A, to limit federal overreach, B, implement term limits, and C, have a balanced budget amendment. The Assembly of States is another group who is simply a collaboration of over 100 legislators from 30 states who are doing a dry run and figuring out what kind of rules would and wouldn't work for such an endeavor. And then Wolfpack, well, that's the super PAC in the business of putting super PACs out of business by getting a common sense campaign finance reform amendment. So, as you stated, Congress shall call a convention on the application of 2/3 of the states. And between these groups and others, there have been literally hundreds of convention calls, between 400 and 700 depending on which expert you ask. And yet, we somehow haven't had one. Why? Because the agendas don't match. The different calls want very specific issues addressed, just like the groups I mentioned before, and just like the Justice Department said, Congress can limit what they talk about, so can a convention of the states.
I'm here to talk to you about what may happen if we call a constitutional convention. Now, with how we've interpreted the Constitution and Article 5, constitutional conventions may not be limited. This means if you plan to hold a constitutional convention for, say, term limits, we can discuss anything. Anything. There is nothing in the Constitution that would limit the scope of a constitutional convention to only the topics in which we have called a convention about.
When it comes to limits, there's quite a few of them. As the first limitation, an Article 5 convention can only propose amendments. That's it. And such proposals have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states before they're considered to be part of the Constitution, whether they're proposed by a convention or by Congress. In a 1987 report about Article 5, the Department of Justice stated, and I'll quote, Article 5 permits the states to apply for and the Congress to call a constitutional convention for limited purposes, and that a variety of practical means to enforce such limitations are available. The language and structure of Article 5, as well as the history of its drafting, supports this conclusion. Because the two methods of constitutional amendment, congressional initiative and the state-called convention, are treated by Article 5 equally available procedural alternatives, there is no suggestion that alternative modes are substantially distinct, that one is subordinate to the other, or that use of one mode is restricted to particular topics or circumstances. Since it is undisputed that Congress possesses the authority to propose amendments limited to single topic or group of topics, it follows that the applications of the states calling for a constitutional convention may also be limited. This understanding is reinforced by the normal practice of the states in limiting by subject their applications to the Congress. And this passage brings up a really important point. While I've been talking about conventions called under the authority of Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, such conventions are also called constitutional conventions. Constitutional convention is not a legal definition. It's a loose term which could really be synonymous with a problem-solving task force that's called to either create a constitution or authorized by a constitution to make amendments or some other business. A convention called under Article 5, which has never happened by the way, is a completely different beast from the convention that happened in Philadelphia in 1776. That convention was called under the authority of the Articles of Confederation. The U.S. Constitution didn't even exist yet, so that was not an Article 5 convention.
A constitutional convention could open us up to more severe gerrymandering, to more severe polarization, or to unlimited spending. It can allow special interest groups, as well as some of the wealthiest people in our country, to completely rewrite our Constitution.
Funny enough, there's a word for that already. Congress. That word is Congress. Congress is owned by the wealthy and the special interest groups. That's why it's important that we push for a convention. If Congress won't get off its butt and do its job, it's the state's job to get off their butt and do it for them.
So please, just maybe do me a favor if you've gotten this far. Listen to someone that you normally wouldn't. Hear a viewpoint that you normally wouldn't. Just listen. Just hear each other.
In closing, I just want to say that I did try to help out in the comment section of your video and answer people's questions about Article 5 and how delegates are chosen and all of that other stuff. And I got blocked. So I was unable to help, which is unfortunate because there are answers to all of your other questions too. But this video is already getting long. Maybe that'll have to be part 2. I'd much rather have a conversation rather than just be limited to chirping into the wind. Thanks for listening.
Because you're not that different, and we all deserve a chance to be heard.